Hey guys, Jason and Brandon here with Geissele Automatics. Today we're going to talk to you about our trigger lineup. And one of the most popular questions we get when it comes to our triggers is, what's the best trigger to use? Well, short answer is, it depends. So in this video, we're going to give you some things to consider as you're choosing the trigger for your next build.
So different triggers, right, are designed for different applications. In this video, we really kind of just wanted to walk you through the different considerations when selecting these triggers.
So probably one of the most important questions is, why should you consider choosing a Geissele trigger?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go over some of the materials and process. So essentially, we use a precision investment casting system, right? We have a wire EDM cut tool steel trigger. And the cool thing about that, right, is it's actually part of the more modernized process of what Eugene Stoner did back in the day. Now, with that being said, we utilize a much stronger material than he did. But that wire EDM system allows us to really cut those critical engagement surfaces, and it's what makes a Geissele trigger a Geissele trigger.
Got it. EDM, electrical discharge machining.
Yeah, 100%.
Got it.
It's a really cool process. It's a little bit more in depth, but good is never good enough when we want the highest quality, and that's how we get it.
So using quality materials is only half of the equation. Our commitment to our quality control is equally as important. So we have very specific standards in place for important measurements like sear engagement and trigger pull weight. So here at the shop, we implement those quality control processes to ensure that reliability and consistency with all of our triggers.
All right, guys, just want to talk a little bit about the types of triggers that we make. So we do make a single stage trigger, a two-stage trigger, and then we have a rolling hybrid brake. It's going to be like our Super 3 gun competition stuff. We have three major components for the triggers, right? We have the actual hammer itself, we have the disconnector, and that sits inside the trigger body, so all three. So unlike some other trigger designs, our trigger utilizes the same number of parts as a mil-spec trigger to ensure that same level of functionality and reliability. This really helps when shooting suppressed or underneath adverse conditions.
So when selecting the right trigger for a specific setup, what are some things we really want to consider?
Because the trigger, right, is set up for each different scenario here, we want to make sure that we give you the right tool for the right job. So the ideal trigger, right, for someone shooting precision is going to be different than someone who's in competition shooting versus someone who is, looking for a duty style trigger, military, law enforcement, defense, right?
Sure.
So what we want to do is we want to make sure, like I said, get the right trigger in your hands for what your application is. Those newer shooters may find that they tend to gravitate towards something with a little bit more flex and forgiveness, like something the SSAs. Meanwhile, a more experienced shooter, right, be more comfortable with a technique-based trigger like the Super 3 gun for competition, or an SSAE that has that crisp take up and break.
Let's talk about trigger brake style, right? We have a couple different trigger brakes, as you mentioned. We have our single stage, our two stage, and our rolling brake. I think the best place to start is really with a two stage. And a lot of newer shooters specifically aren't gonna maybe understand exactly what I mean by two stage trigger. So with a two stage trigger, there's two definitive different phases of the trigger press. The first phase, when you make contact with that trigger, start working the trigger rearwards, is gonna be slack. It's gonna be some spring tension you're feeling, you're taking up some of that trigger tension, right? Yes. And then you're gonna come to a definitive wall, a place of actual resistance. Once you get to that wall, you're gonna need to apply some additional pressure to release the hammer and break the shot. So the way I like to think about it is, you like coffee?
Absolutely.
I love coffee, right? So I drink a lot of coffee. So let's say I'm on my way to work in the morning, forgot to make coffee, so I go to Dunkin' or something like that, right? I order a large hot cup of coffee, I get to the window, I pay, they hand me my coffee, thank you guys, I love you, I'll see you tomorrow. I start driving away and I realize they didn't put a lid on my hot cup of coffee. Yikes, right? So I'm trying to drive to work without spilling this hot cup of coffee. I'm going through the parking lot, I come up to a speed bump. What am I doing?
I'm braking.
Right, I'm slowing down.
Hard.
So if I go right over that speed bump with that hot cup of coffee, I'm definitely spilling my coffee. Not a good time, right? So how do I go over the speed bump without spilling that coffee? I'm gonna slow down, come to that speed bump, rolling stop, slowly, smoothly go over that speed bump, right? In that analogy, that second stage wall is that speed bump. You can come up to that wall, stage there and prep the shot. And then when you're ready, a little bit minimal amount of pressure and then you can break the shot. So it gives you a lot of control over the trigger. You can run that pretty fast if you need to, but it's definitely a consistent way to employ that trigger. Now, a lot of the questions we get from newer shooters that are used to a standard, maybe a mil-spec trigger is, why should I switch from a single stage to a two stage, right? A lot of people are used to that single stage. That's what they know.
It's a common thing.
Right, and sometimes people think different is bad. So the question I usually ask them is, okay, so if you're running a single stage trigger in your AR, what kind of trigger are you running in your pistol, right? So what kind of pistols are most people shooting these days?
Most of the people, it's just Glocks, SIGs, 320s, 365s.
Right, Smith & Wesson MPs.
Yeah, everything.
Right, so what kind of triggers do they have?
It's all technically a two-stage.
Two-stage, right?
Yeah.
When you're shooting those triggers effectively, you're coming up to the wall, and getting ready for the shot, and then breaking it when you have your sight alignment, sight picture, and you're ready to go, right? So why not run the same style of trigger in your AR as your self-defense or combat or duty pistol, right?
That's a good point, Jason. Let's kick it over to the man himself, the guy that started it all, Bill Geissele. He's our founder. He's gonna have a little bit more information for you guys on how we got started making triggers.
Hello, everyone. This is Bill Geissele. I wanted to take the time and talk to you a little bit about the beginnings of Geissele and why Geissele triggers are set up the way they are. Back in the day, and when I say the day, I'm talking about the 1990s, when it came to high power shooting, you could go to Camp Perry and there would literally be thousands of people on the line. I'd say 3/4 of the line was shooting M1As or M14s. And the AR-15 was the newfangled gun on the block. Out of high power shooting, I gravitated to the AR-15. And the reason why is that the M1A needed a gunsmith to assemble for it to be in any way, shape, or form accurate. One of the things I found with the AR-15 is that it lacked a good trigger. We all know that you need a good barrel. We all know that you need good ammunition, all right? We all know that you need a good hold and good eyesight because it was only iron sights back then. But the trigger was so important. And what I found was many things that were lacking in the triggers back then, and I decided to make my own because I was sick and tired of breaking a perfect shot at 600 and having a 7 go out at 2 o'clock. How come? I could never understand. And so what I did was I designed our high-speed national match trigger, and I brought it to Camp Perry in 2004. And immediately I was squatted with an AMU shooter, and I was doing very good at 600 yards, and he asked me the win call, which is pretty much saying that you're doing something good. He asked me what my win call was he was going up to the line. And afterwards I got talking to him. I showed him my trigger, and he said, take it over to the truck and show Mr. Clark. And Mr. Clark was the lead gunsmith for the Army Marksmanship Unit back then. They had a trailer off to the side of the firing line, which is where they did gunsmithing work on their shooters' guns. I went and took it to Mr. Clark, and the first words out of that man's mouth was, what hammer spring does it use? And I said, well, it uses an M16A1 hammer spring. And he said, that's good, because we won't put any trigger in our guns that has a compromised hammer spring. From that national match high speed, my company started to grow. More and more high power shooters got on board with it as they found the ease of adjustment, where you could change your sear engagement, your second stage weight, your first stage weight, your over travel, how the trigger bow was pushed forward 1/8 of an inch, and it lessened your finger crowding. As soon as people got behind one of our triggers, their scores went up. Their offhand scores went up due to the superior lock time. Their overall accuracy on their guns went up because we were using a full power hammer spring. And in 2006, I received a phone call from US SOCOM asking me about a select fire trigger if I made one for the M4 carbine and the Heckler & Koch HK416. So when we made the HK416 trigger, I didn't necessarily have the ability to physically fire the amount of rounds through the trigger before I sent it off to my military customer. So how would I tell whether or not this trigger is going to last? How do I know if the sear surfaces are going to wear down or there's some other type of problem with the trigger? So what I did is I built a trigger tester. The first one that I built was all mechanical. So I'd set it up in my home, and at that time I was living in a row home, and I put this thing all the way down in the basement, and at night I'd listen to it. Click, 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 click. So eventually I speeded this guy up. I found a new gearbox for it, and I managed to get this guy running faster. And now I refer to that trigger tester as Old Betsy. Now our trigger was adopted for the HK416. This trigger I called the SSF, Super Select Fire. And there was a special model for the HK416. For one thing, the HK416 has a firing pin safety. It's this little flapper on the bolt carrier. And basically, if the gun is dropped muzzle down, this prevents the firing pin from moving forward. That gradually grew into a trigger that the military fell in love with. SOCOM came to me, Crane, Naval Surface Warfare Center, and wanted to use this trigger and standardize on it. And they took our trigger and they put it through a whole battery of tests. This trigger then became safety certified by SOCOM, and both of them received a national stock number, an NSN. Back in the day, 1, 2, maybe 3 types of triggers. Now there's probably 30. What is the benefits of the Geissele trigger? Are there benefits of other triggers versus the Geissele? These are some of the things that Jason and Brandon are going to talk to you about. And I want that younger generation, all right, to be the one communicating to you, because I'm from the old school. And when I talk about things at Camp Perry and things in 1995 and 1996, this is ancient history. And there's a new generation out here. New generation of younger shooters who have grabbed the torch from their fathers and their grandfathers and is taking that torch and holding it high. Our Second Amendment rights set in stone in our Constitution, our ability to protect ourselves, protect our families in our home and outside our homes. And this torch has to be passed on. That's why you're going to see them talking to you and me fading on into the background here as I let the company go forward with new blood. Okay? That's a little bit of my story right here. I'll let Brandon and Jason take it from here. Thank you, as always, for your business at Geissele.
Hey, Jason, can you just tell me a little bit more about our flagship triggers?
Sure. So our 2 flagship triggers are the SSA, Super Semi-Automatic, and our SSAE, our Super Semi-Automatic Enhanced. Note that the enhanced tag, the E, is basically going to note that it's a lighter, crisper trigger. They're both 2-stage triggers, so they both have that, slack, that take up the discernible wall before you break the trigger. So our SSA is going to be a more well-rounded trigger. It's the semi-auto version of our Super Select Fire used by SOCOM, and it's going to be about 4.5 pounds total pull weight, with about 1 3/4 to 2 pounds on that second stage wall. Now that second stage wall is going to have a little bit of flex and forgiveness, and we kind of talk about it like it's snapping a carrot with your finger. So there's that little bit of flex, and then the trigger is going to break. Now, why would you want that in a trigger? Keep in mind that this is designed as a combat style trigger. So when your adrenaline's pumping, you're in a dynamic shooting environment or stressful shooting situation, you want to be able to reliably and consistently come up to the wall of the trigger without breaking it, so that you can break the shot only when you really intend to.
So Jason, if the SSA is more or less a carrot, what's the SSAE like?
Sure. So instead of that carrot-like break with the flex and forgiveness of the SSA, the SSAE, or enhanced version, is going to feel more like you're snapping an icicle, right? As you come up to that second stage wall, right? There's only going to be about 1 pound needed to break that trigger, and it's going to feel like you're just snapping an icicle.
Got it.
So SSA and SSAE, those are essentially the 2 families of our trigger line in terms of the 2-stage. All of our other 2-stage triggers are going to fall into one of those 2 camps, right? Now, a lot of shooters, they like that 2-stage trigger feel, but maybe they like a flat trigger bow. Very popular, right?
It's all about preference.
Right. So with a flat bow, like our SDC here, it's going to maintain the same pull weights in relative to that SSA, SSAE. So our Super Dynamic Combat, again, SD is going to denote a flat trigger bow, which you'll see across our lineup. And the Super Dynamic Combat trigger is going to mirror our SSA, just with that flat-faced trigger bow.
Gotcha.
The SDE, Super Dynamic Enhanced, that's going to mirror the SSAE. So again, the only difference being the shape of the trigger bow, a flat versus a curve. Now you may think, why would I want one over the other? Again, largely preference, but an easy way to think about a flat bow is, what is a trigger? It's essentially a lever, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So with a curved trigger profile, as your finger makes contact and starts applying pressure, it's naturally going to want to find the apex, the furthermost curve of the trigger. With a flat bow, you can apply pressure. The further down your finger is, the more pressure you can apply as that lever working back from that fulcrum. So if you're applying pressure lower on the trigger, it's going to feel like a lighter trigger pull. So it gives you some more options, and some shooters feel that gives them more control over the trigger. One of our most popular ones right now is our X series. So again, SSA X, SSA EX. They have what we call our lightning bow, which is a semi-curved profile. So it's not flat, it's not a traditional curve, it's about halfway between. That gives you kind of the benefits of either or. So you have a little bit more familiarity with your curved trigger profile, but you also can apply leverage a little bit easier, like our flat-faced triggers.
Yeah, we believe it's kind of the best of both worlds.
Best of both worlds. And also the trigger body itself is actually wider. So for me, I feel like I get a little bit more contact in terms of surface area on the trigger bow itself for feeling in control of that trigger. So in addition to that lightning bow profile and that wider trigger body, which offers more control of the trigger and more contact, another thing that we want to touch on with the X series is the nano weapons coating. So that nano weapons coating is found on the trigger body, the disconnector, and the hammer as well.
Yeah, the nano weapon coating is really important. It's a durable solid lubricant, which is superior coating we use on the BCGs and the muzzle devices that are on our Super Duty rifles.
Right.
It offers extreme corrosion and wear resistance, and it makes cleaning an absolute breeze.
So one of our other triggers in our two-stage trigger lineup is the Super Tricon trigger, Super T. Starts off as a curved trigger, but kind of flattens out. And we actually designed this in cooperation with Jeff Gonzalez from Trident Concepts, former Navy SEAL, and he gave us his input and we helped us design this trigger. So think of this as pretty much an SSA in terms of the pull profile, but it's going to be designed to shine in maritime environments. A couple reasons there. Number one, the trigger bow itself, in addition to that kind of flattening out at the end, it also has these ribs here on the trigger bow, which gives you a little bit more traction on the trigger bow itself.
Especially if you're wearing gloves.
Right, when you're wearing gloves or you're in a wet, slippery environment. The trigger spring is also stainless steel, which helps prevent corrosion.
Yeah, that's super important because that has its own maintenance kit. So those springs are specific to it.
So in theory, if you have any of our triggers in a wet environment, you could also get the trigger spring set for this and put it on your other triggers. Coming to our G2S, Geissele two-stage trigger. This one's very popular because honestly, the price point, right?
It's a fantastic deal, I'll be honest with you.
Yeah.
If you can't jump right into an SSA, a G2S is a fantastic alternative.
So our G2S is essentially functionally the same as an SSA once installed. What we do is we kind of streamline that production process, so it makes it easier for us to produce and helps us lower the cost for our customers. So you can get into that one, and once you install it, it has just a little bit of a different installation method. But once it's installed, it's going to be just as reliable and functionally feel the same as our SSA trigger. So definitely something to check out if you're looking for something for value. Our high-speed national match is our only adjustable trigger. So it's going to be able to adjust a couple different things. Number one, your sear engagement, right? We want to make sure that's dialed in for reliability. And then also your second stage pull weight. In addition to that, there's also an over travel adjustment to make sure you can adjust that over travel to dial it in exactly how you need it.
So you can really touch literally anything on this trigger to make it exactly how you want it to be.
Correct. So the thinking with the high-speed national match trigger is a lot of shooters in high power shooting, they need to meet a minimum weight. Like a lot of times, again, maybe 4.5 pounds, right?
Yeah.
Our high-speed national match, that's our only adjustable trigger, and it gives you the ability to adjust sear engagement for reliability, dial in that second stage weight, and then also adjust the over travel if needed, right? So our high-speed national match is going to ship with 3 different spring kits. So it gives you the ability to dial in the trigger exactly as you want it, while also meeting those minimum weight requirements that are often found in competition.
And because it has a little bit more going on, Bill has an amazing 4-part series on YouTube.
Right.
He really dives into everything from resetting the screws, troubleshooting, anything you could possibly want in those 4-part series. It's an amazing watch.
Sure.
So if you have the trigger, I highly recommend tuning in.
Yes, if you're interested, go check that out on our YouTube channel. So this concludes part 1 of our Choosing the Right Trigger series. In our next part, we're going to discuss our single stage triggers, our 3-gun triggers, and some of the other offerings in our lineup.
Be sure to subscribe and follow us on our social media channels. And comment below, what's your favorite trigger that we discussed today?